Hey everybody, Dr. Meri Crowley for Now is the Time. We've got an amazing guest on the program today, SG Anon. SG has been a true friend and a patriot. Many of you love watching him with a number of the different drops that he puts out. And he's been at several of the events that I've put on across the country, Open the Heavens. We're going to be talking about one that was coming up. But before we do that, today's program is sponsored by the Root Brands. Let's roll that commercial, please.
Get all of your cylinders firing at full force with Zero In. A backlog of work, lack of concentration, insufficient energy, high stress levels. We've all had days like this, and just a healthy diet and exercise don't seem enough to restore vitality. But nature offers the best sources of energy, and at Root, we found a way to make the most of them and to create a unique and powerful nutraceutical product. Thanks to Zero In's carefully selected and combined ingredient formula, your physical and most especially cognitive performance will be dramatically enhanced. This combination of ingredients, including vitamin D, coffee plant leaves extract, velvet bean seed powder, pine bark extract, and turmeric root extract, is especially designed to increase cognitive function and mental acuity while clearing your mind and providing greater focus. Additional benefits include improved immune system, improved dopamine and serotonin balance, more restful sleep, improved mood, reduced stress, and improved physical performance. Awaken your mind and your body. Focus your brain naturally.
Yes, so if you go to therootbrands.com and / now is the time, it's my affiliate code. It's free to sign up as an affiliate. Basically, you're just going to put in the affiliate name you want before you shop. But I started with the Trinity Pack. It's Clean Slate. It helps actually take the graphene oxide and the heavy metals out of your blood through a zeolite formulation that also brings the trace minerals back into your body that you need. And then the Restore is for the gut health. And lastly, the Zero In helps your dopamine levels. And so go to rootbrands.com. Now is the time. And it's an amazing product. So anyway, SG, it's good to have you on again. It's been a while. How have you been, my friend?
Busy as heck, Dr. Meri, but doing well. Good to be back.
Yeah, so there's a lot to talk about. I know that around the country, you have spoken at, I think, at least 3, if not 4 of my events that I've done called Open the Heavens. And we're going to be doing the next one in San Francisco. You're not able to come to that one, but the one in Vegas, hopefully you're going to be able to come to next year. But you mentioned about President Trump just actually gave a speech today and talked about San Francisco. Why don't we go into a little bit about what he said today?
Well, I think that's a great place to have the discussion, right? You know, the title of your show, Meri, is Now is the Time. And that was sort of the essence in a lot of ways of what we can take away from President Trump and Secretary Hegseth's remarks today. An unprecedented address, by the way, to the entirety of the Flag Officer Command of the United States military. And this was the largest single address gathering with all of the commanders across the entirety of the armed services since the close and the few years after the Second World War. And so looking at that, one of the remarks, and there's a dozen different remarks that we could drill down on and probably do a whole podcast on each. But one of the remarks that stood out specifically to me was how he talked about the flag officers of the U.S. military, the brass officers, were going to have a part to play, some sort of part to play in the restoration of balance inside our inner cities. And San Francisco was one of the ones that he highlighted. He referenced Chicago and a couple of others. And he specifically said, some of this is going to be a big part of this, I think is what he said, is going to, come back to the people that are in this room. And he made reference to the executive order that he signed last month, where he essentially established presidential directive and memorandum for the for the building and mustering of a quick reaction force to support civilian law enforcement in the execution of the nation's laws, not to replace law enforcement, because that's strictly prohibited through posse comitatus. But supplemental assistance and support is not only not prohibited, but it's in fact encouraged. And we have examples just as recently as about 20 years ago with the 43rd administration seeing this actually done at the national level in the aftermath of 9/11. So when President Trump talks about these inner cities and these large metro areas, and they are primarily in blue areas that are going to be on the radar, so to speak, of the United States military, we have to then assume that the purpose there could in fact be dual or multidimensional. Of course, we want to support the law enforcement. Of course, we want to, ensure that the nation's laws are respected. Of course, we want to repel the invasion. And he talked about how the United States has in fact suffered an invasion. He called it an invasion, but not in the typical fashion because, and I quote, "these people don't wear uniforms." So in other words, this is not, a surface level warfare on warfare situation. It's very much an irregular or an unconventional style of warfare that's been waged, and an invasion that's been waged into the interior of the United States. But when we look at these areas that he's also referencing, Portland, Chicago, San Francisco, we saw the Marine Corps in LA earlier this year, which was sort of like a trial run or a beta test, in my opinion, really a gauge of the public temperature and the public tolerance for something like that. These areas are also significant hotbeds of criminal underbelly activity. We're talking about black market arms dealing. We're talking about black market child sex trafficking and human trafficking, weapons trafficking, biological agent smuggling. All of these things happen throughout the port cities of the United States of America and in the deep blue inner city areas, sort of like internal, interior forts, if you will, or interior bastions, hotbeds of these types of activities. And those activities are going to have to be stamped out in a coordinated fashion between civilian and military capability, because you have civilian and militarized criminal apparatuses at play. And so President Trump, in his address today, I think what we can take away from that in a big way is that the military is preparing to remember its oath, is preparing to do what it is supposed to do. But President Trump reminded the officers no less than 3 or 4 separate times today that it's all about defending the homeland. It's all about protecting the American people. And he reminded them as well that many flag officers in the last few years have been replaced because, and I quote, "we know everything about everybody." So that was a shot across the bow to the room, in my opinion, where he was essentially saying, the events ahead, the path ahead is going to be a little bit difficult. You used the word dicey before we got on the call today. And if anyone thinks that they're going to become the problem cog in the wheel, we have ways of dealing with that. So I think that we have a lot to take away from this. And I think that the country, especially in the aftermath of Mr. Kirk's death earlier this month, I think the country is really ready to move towards the resolution of serious militarized criminal activity, which continues to destabilize our communities even today.
Well, and San Francisco, if you look at it, that's where Gavin Newsom is. I mean, you see California, that most of California is a red. It's only certain areas and populations in California. And of course, we know they become more selections than elections. And so I look at it as a showdown in San Francisco. There's an event, we'll just briefly touch on it for the people that are watching, on 11/1, which is technically All Saints Day, the day after, well, I don't even reference Halloween. It was really Reformation Day in 1517 when Martin Luther, the great reformist, pretty much tacked the 95 Theses on the door of the chapel in Wittenberg, Germany, and the Great Reformation started. And so we're at a time in our country, SG, and everyone watching, that God is bringing forth a reformation, not just a revival, but a reformation of society. And that's why it's taken back these cities. But, SG, we did the first one in, Mount Rushmore. You were at that one. The second one was in Chicago. You were at that one. The third one was in, Champions Church, excuse me, in Winter Haven, Florida. You were there. The fourth one, you were at San Diego too, and Nampa, Boise, Idaho. You were there. The last one we did, you weren't at, but you were pretty much at every single Open the Heavens that we've had except one. And this one, the Open the Heavens in San Francisco, Keys to the Golden Gate, the city of San Francisco, and we'll just be brief about that because we want to get a lot of more information about SG and what he knows. But We are doing it at the Scottish Rites Masonic Lodge. I understand what the Masonic Rites Lodge is. So people, we know what we're doing. There's a church that's been meeting there for 7 years called the Father's House. There's things that are getting ready to flip, but we're actually taking a stand. The people that we're having, Pastor Dave Bryan, the showdown with Anton LaVey on Halloween in 1997. The Church of Satan was set up in San Francisco, the showdown, and I think we're going to come on SG's show to talk about that. Apostle Chuck Pierce, Glory of Zion, a very well-known voice in the community, in particular the prophetic and apostolic community. He talks about, SG, that there's 2 root systems in California. And he said we have to take back in the atmosphere, in the spiritual realm, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Sacramento. And then we've got Lou Engle, who's literally been used to mobilize thousands of people at the malls in Washington last year, October 13th, Yom Kippur. There was 400,000 people, which I was one of them, that they literally came together on Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and repented. And I believe God heard those prayers, like in 2 Chronicles 7:14. And God did hear our prayers and is healing our land. And then Pastor Cheon, one of my pastors who's running for governor in California, I'm going to show my Freedom Cry film. But this is on 11/1. It's free to register, but if you get your VIP ticket before October 15th, it'll only be $177, which includes VIP lunch, meet and greet with all the speakers, as well as VIP seating and underground parking. So go to MeriCrowley.com. We've already got almost half the VIPs sold. There's only going to be 160 VIPs because the banquet room can only hold that many. So I wanted to get that out there. SG is not able to come to this one, but the one in Vegas next year in March, April, hopefully SG will be at that one. So Open the Heavens, Keys to the Golden Gate. This will be the 7th Open the Heavens that we've done in the last 2 years. And I believe this is going to be the mother load that we're going to see a great, in the heavenly realm. We're going to see God open the heavens over that city. So SG, I know that I wanted to get that in so people can hear about it. We will stream it. Last time that you were with us, we were in Nampa last November, SG, almost a year. And remember the warfare we had on that one? All the flights that were canceled out of Denver because it snowed. And yeah.
I do. Yes, I absolutely remember. And it was such an obvious and extraordinarily unusual sequence of events. And the event itself ended up being very, very powerful, even though the turnout was a little bit smaller. I was actually quite surprised and very pleasantly encouraged.
Well, and to your credit, SG ended up putting it out, streamed it as we streamed it, but there was thousands of people watched because SG, you put it on your network. And I know Dr. Scott Young was supposed to be there, and Jim Price and different ones. Scott Young's wife got violently ill. Jim couldn't get out. Same thing. The airports were closed. And you had to change your flight like 2 or 3 times. And you finally got there, and you got there for the very last session. So SG is truly a true warrior for the kingdom, and we really honor you for that, SG. But explain kind of maybe some of the tunnel systems under San Francisco. And if you look back at the history of San Francisco, even in 1978 in November, where Harvey Milk, the first gay legislator that was, basically, that got in office, was assassinated in City Hall along with Mayor George Marconi. And so it was right after that the gay pride movement really took off because everyone thought, okay, well, we're going to come out now. We're going to let our voices be heard. And so what do you have to say about San Francisco and some of the things that you know about that city and why it's relevant?
Well, it's very interesting, with how I look at San Francisco and the way that I interpret a lot of things with San Francisco. I think I'm going to have to take the audience back to a more spiritual or, perhaps umbrella lens or a long-term generational style lens with this area. And I want to talk a little bit about the energy that the Holy Spirit of God imbues into the earth at different points, right? We know that the Jerusalem temple was built in the particular spot that it was built upon for a reason, because of the power, the spiritual power of the imbuement of the earth in that area. The same could be said in some regards of the Machu Picchu temples in the high Incan mountains or the Giza pyramids, right? People being moved towards these very spiritually powerful places. And so the same is true across the entirety of North America. We're certainly no different in that regard. And California in particular, and the Nevada, Arizona areas, all have ancestral association, not just in the more modern Christian schools, but even going back to some of these other spiritual schools of thought over the last few hundred years that really believe these areas offer natural gifts of the Spirit. They offer enhanced amplification, for lack of a better expression of it. And San Francisco is a particular one because of the nature of the Bay Area and how it's carved right into the side of the Californian countryside there, right? And you have the deep water Pacific Ocean that's right off of the coast. And of course, water itself is highly electrically conductive. And so when we look at the electromagnetism of the earth, anytime you put a focusing mechanism or a Bay Area inside of a place like that on a grand scale, you're amplifying and focusing a lot of that energy. And so as we look at, the enemy having control of, the powers of the air, right? The principalities and powers of the air over the last several thousand years, going back really since the very beginning. As we look at the influence that the enemy has been able to accomplish with respect to criminal activity, with respect to keeping people, quite frankly, in a sin modality, in a sin behavior, being called down into the darker parts of who they as the human being really truly are. As we look at all of that, you can track different areas where it seems to be a lot more hyper-focused. Chicago is one of them. San Francisco is one of them. New York City is one of them. When we think about the Gotham comics, that's exactly the extension of the construct that I'm talking about. And so with San Francisco, they're no different than a lot of these other places. They have a long history of occultic influence. They have a long history of dark Luciferian influence at the pulpit of power, going all of the way back to the Second World War and before. The Golden Gate Bridge itself is a phenomenal example of a project that did a great deal of good, but also allowed for a great deal of evil, because while everyone's attention was focused on the construction on the top of the water, on the building of the bridge itself, the cavern systems beneath the bay were being more filled out and expanded. And the Alcatraz Island point out in the Bay Area itself actually became an infill and exfill point for those very underground cavern systems, which would then stretch from the bay out into the California countryside, back to the countryside, and they would actually have junction nodes around large areas. The bread factory of 1906, that was one of the very large junction nodes that was expanded during the 20th century. I've heard that there's churches in the area that have underground tunnel connections. Some of those churches tie back to the Bush family. There's an interesting Anon online called Trader Girl Q, and I would refer your audience to at least go and look at her stuff. Some of her stuff, sort of doesn't jive, but other decodes and things that she's put out make a whole heck of a lot of sense. She's a San Francisco native, so she understands the area really well. And then those, on the other side of that, those tunnel systems beneath the bay go down the coastline and then across out into the ocean to various submarine, docks and islands and points like that. So it's the same general structure. It's the same general layout. It's very, very old. We could take a history lesson and go back at least a few hundred years with respect to the development of like the Hawaiian Islands, the development of the Fijian Islands, and the different lore in those areas about underground entities and about demonic entities hiding out in the lower portions of like the oceanic area. So all of that sort of being ancillary and tangential to the point, the San Francisco area, and specifically the Alcatraz connection to the coastline and the Golden Gate Bridge and its general corridor and traversal through there, there's a lot of infrastructure that is criminal in nature, or at the very least is underbelly style in nature, that has to be dealt with. And so we've seen a lot of different earthquakes up and down the Pacific Rim over the last 5 years, much more than normal relative to the annual output going back about 40 or 50 years. When we look at the record keeping, I would purport to the audience that there's at least a chance some of that is inorganic and artificial, meaning that there's some sort of EOD or some sort of explosive engagement happening in the underground area. A lot of your audience, Meri, is probably familiar by now with the facts that the U.S. Army spent nearly $600 billion in 2016, 17, and 18 specifically to train the fighting force for subterranean blackout warfare. And so what that is being, in an underground corridor space or fighting in a subterranean space where you truly have no access to outside air, outside light, anything like that. And so it would make sense then, if we're going to interdict something underground, we would have to be prepared and trained in order to do that. So I know I'm going long on this question here, but I want to bring it around for the audience. So when we come back to President Trump's remarks about what's, the military being involved potentially with San Francisco, supporting civilian law enforcement missions. When President Trump talks about the military securing the southern border, we know that the southern border has been a hotbed of underground activity for a long time. All you have to do is look at any modern cinema or modern media to know that. Breaking Bad, a number of other different shows out there showing how there's, an entire underground world of movement that occurs along the border area. And, California is, of course, included in that. And so all of this I find very, very interesting, dovetailing together. And when we talk about restoring the law and order, when we talk about restoring civil stability and civil society, we have to restore it both on the surface and underneath. If there's a criminal enterprise operating, for purposes of my example here, in the sewers of whatever city that you're in, then you're not really free. You're not operating in a safe society. You could vanish into a manhole at any moment and no one would be able to, stop that from happening. Or a child could vanish off the side of the street into a manhole and no one would ever know what happened to them. And that's simply not allowable anymore. It's been going on too long. And I think you're going to see a lot of this exposed in the broader narrative as these raids and operations to restore the quote unquote immigration issue begin to make the news.
Well, and also President Trump has brought up, I think a few months ago, he talked about that they were going to reopen Alcatraz. What do you know about that?
Well, it's fascinating because in order to reopen something, one has to dispatch, engineering teams and security teams and mapping teams, cartography teams, all of these types of things in order to go into the facility to ensure that, the records, whatever records they have in the most recent history, align with the current condition, to evaluate the current condition and establish the new record and the new status of operation. All of these sorts of things have to occur. And I find it very interesting that we would do that with the DHS and the FBI. And one of the things, and the DEA, and one of the things that I remember President Trump putting out for the eyes of the world with respect to that was that it would be the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security in coordination and conjunction with the U.S. Bureau of Prisons who were going to oversee the spearhead, essentially, of those initial operations, those initial reactivation and mapping and sort of like checking your status operations. And in so doing that, you introduce law enforcement to the entirety of the facility, not just the first few levels. You introduce law enforcement to the basement levels, right, where executions happened, where escapes happened, where medical experimentation occurred without the inmates' consent, where all sorts of things were going on. And they'll be able to provide, of course, to their organizations, which ideally at some point will then arrive out into the public space, a true mapping, a true layout of what was actually equipped here and what was being done here and how we can improve the facility and use it for our purposes now. We know that there's a tremendous amount of criminal activity out there that is bona fide, it's capital level, and it needs a pretty significant lockup capability. There's a lot of that happening both in the domestic population and in the illegal alien population that's here inside the United States of America. So, of course, the use for Alcatraz, I think, or any other reactivated prison complex, it sort of is implicit and understood when we look at the scope of the problem. But the part that I think people miss a little bit is that we get the chance to go in and take true accounting of what these facilities have been used for in the past, and that's necessary in order to prevent it from happening again.
Well, and as we finish up about San Francisco, I mean, looking back at the history, this is where the gold rush, the California gold rush that happened. And, in 1906, when there was a great move of God that actually happened down in Los Angeles, known as the Azusa Street Revival on April 9th, with William J. Seymour, who was pretty much a one-eyed black man. He was blind in one eye. His father actually fought in the Union Army and was emancipated SG, when he fought for the Union Army under Abraham Lincoln's directives. When the Civil War, interestingly enough, ended on April 9th, 1865, it was 41 years later that God brought forth, through the son of a former slave, William Seymour, this revival known as Azusa Street, A to Z USA. And over 500 million people attribute their spirituality and Pentecostalism back to Azusa Street. And I bring that up because it was 9 days later after that that the great earthquake of San Francisco happened on April 18th, 1906, and 80% of the city was destroyed. And it was from that that actually literally almost catapulted this move of God in LA to where millions of people started turning back to God because of events they started to see. So I think what we're seeing, SG, is that something is being set up. President Trump is warning and kind of getting people prepared. We're coming into October. You know, a lot of times you're hearing people talk about Red October, that things, when God spoke to me, that things were going to get dicey. When I looked up the word dicey, it says a little dangerous and unpredictable. And so, you know, San Francisco, there's been so many movies that they show the Golden Gate Bridge like coming down or blowing up or different things like that. And do you know, SG, that the movie industry actually first started in San Francisco? And after that earthquake literally came down to Southern California, but it really started in the Bay Area.
Well, and you bring up perhaps the most fascinating, evidence. And even though it's circumspect evidence, when you look at the whole of the cinematic space, along with, the symbolism that the opponent that we're talking about really loves to use. We're talking about occultists who are absolutely married to the idea of, certain spiritual esotericism, and they use it quite literally religiously. And so when we look at that, it makes a great deal of sense that something like the Golden Gate Bridge would be utilized or could be utilized as the catalyst for a serious, perhaps a generational level of a national revival, right? In the same fashion that 9/11/2001 was used as a generational level schism against our society, right? We saw the entirety of the Constitution essentially shredded in the emergency conditions after that particular event, which many people believe nowadays to be, a U.S. government false flag, at the very least carried out with coordination, in coordination with domestic actors here in the United States. And so it produced, really resonant and long-term effects within the population. And I could see something like the Golden Gate, which of course is on the West Coast. And President Trump talks about the golden age all of the time, the golden age of America, and how he wants this quantum leap and, the standard of life and the American standard of living. So I could see that absolutely happening. I'm reluctant to definitively say one way or another, because the truth be told, I really just do not know. I know that we're anticipating significant escalation of events. I know that President Trump has been talking for 2.5 years about a major attack of some kind happening inside the United States. And while we've seen escalating events, I don't think we've seen a true societal or civilization level attack. And that seems to be the rhetoric that President Trump has sort of painted and cast for us a few separate times. But again, and I don't want to wax overly repetitive on the issue, but when we examine the fact that the entirety of Flag Officer Command for the United States Armed Forces were recalled from their forward operating bases around the world and brought back stateside to a Marine Corps base. And the Marine Corps holds a special place with respect to the president because they're a quick reaction force that acts only under presidential authority. This very much seems like a significant event in preparation for something further. President Trump has talked about the Iron Dome, the need for a missile defense system. He's talked about restoring order in our cities. He's talked about, we having an enemy within. He used that terminology several times today with the flag officer address in Quantico, Virginia. And so when we look at what the enemy within is capable of, I don't think we need to kid ourselves. The enemy within has had a half century to entrench themselves. They love their dark occultism and their symbolism. They love doing things cyclically, especially in cycles of threes. They love targeting specific areas because of what they believe to be amplified spiritual enhancement of their occultism on that side of the veil. And California, Nevada, Oregon, Arizona, along with Illinois and the upper eastern seaboard of the United States, all of these areas offer that, again, according to their own documents and words. And so as we look at San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge, and again, I don't want to wax too repetitive on it, but as we look at all of these different things, it makes a great deal of sense that a possible national catalyst would be a serious attack or perhaps a serious natural disaster that destroys the Golden Gate Bridge.
Well, and just to kind of finish up on this region, because there's a lot of other things to talk about, but looking at the history even of San Francisco with the Summer of Love in 1967, a number of things, the music, the sounds that came out of that area, Bill Graham, the Doors, the Grateful Dead, they just actually had a 60-year reunion in Golden Gate Park of the Grateful Dead. I think it was August 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. But, God spoke to me and said, there's a greater move of God. There's a greater wave coming than any movement known to man, including Azusa Street and the Jesus movement, which literally affected millions. But going back into history, because I look at history, when General George Washington was at Valley Forge, SG in 1777, and you guys can research this. Actually, there was a 99-year-old man that was there at Valley Forge during this time and recounted the story that said an angel came in and said, "Son of the Republic, listen and learn. There's going to be 3 perils that's going to come upon America." Excuse me. First one described the Civil War. The first one described the American Revolution. Second one described the Civil War, but the third one would be the worst, that America would be surrounded. But this angel said the Union would prevail. So I think that what we're coming up to, and as like Juan will say, and I've interviewed Juan many times, that it will look like a near-death experience, but that America would be reborn. And so we cannot be overcome with fear or worry at this time, but know that the one who sits in the heavens, God, is going to laugh because the enemy is making war. If he can't get God, he'll go after his children. And that's why trafficking is such a vile thing that the enemy tries to do. And so, there's been many reports, SG, moving over to another topic, about Al-Qaeda being on our soil, and that there's going to be a number of cities that are going to be targeted. I know Juan talked about the 10 different cities that were going to be targeted. And so I feel that President Trump is getting people prepared and ready. What do you know about some of these reports about Al-Qaeda? We know that the borders were open and there was thousands of bad actors and, terrorists that are on our soil right now.
Well, from what I understand, and I've sort of evaluated this issue over the last several years, but I would guesstimate based on reports that we have anywhere from 700,000 up to about 1.5 million illegal aliens inside the United States that offer a militarized capability, that are ideologically attached, and may or may not be part of a broader state actor situation. And so that's an extremely large private army for hire. And I think we have to acknowledge that this was always part of what was going to happen here, because the intelligence community, the mercenary puppeteers of the entirety of privatized terror worldwide, are primarily operating, or have been operating, out of Langley, United States, and out of London and Rome and Tel Aviv and a few other areas. And they've made this sort of axis of mercenary, rent and army control around the entirety of the planet. And the army, the assets built up, the mercenary complex, has to be dealt with. And the only fighting force on planet Earth, even now, capable of doing that is the United States military. So as we look at what's happening inside the homeland, I think that we're going to see a lot of escalating events, probably rather rapidly, as we look at the civilian spearhead of law enforcement going in on these immigration issues that are going to attempt to destabilize society, and they're likely to come from ideological groups. And those groups are likely to be sort of the same old dog and pony show groups. But it's worth keeping in mind for your audience out there that most of them are in service not just to an ideology or a faith or a religion, but are in fact first and foremost in service to a paycheck. And so as you look at, Ayatollah Khomeini from Tehran, for example, here's a good example of this. Ayatollah Khomeini is about as Iranian as I am, in the sense that he's an individual that has ancestral lineage, blood ties, and a deeply rooted faith to Persia. That is simply not true. His father was a wealthy oil tycoon out of the UK. The man was educated in Britain. So he's not the true representation of the Iranian people, in the same fashion that a lot of these terroristic cells or a lot of these privatized army cells and gang cells that are going to activate, they're not representing by and large a population group. They're representing a cohesive work group. They have work colleagues. Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they're all the same thing, right? When we look at the funding, when we look at the backing, when we look at the facilitation of the transportation through the Western Hemisphere, they're all acting in behest and in conjunction with UN-affiliated groups or Soros-affiliated groups. Mostly, they're being given harbor by the same style NGOs and the same various, nexus and node points here inside the United States that all tie back to the same, capitalistic, what I say, philanthropic capitalistic interests, so-called philanthropic interests. And so I think we're going to see a great deal of them activated in efforts to resist what is going to become a crackdown, not only on immigration, but upon the entirety of what has amounted to a soft invasion over the last 25 to 35 years.
Well, looking back, SG, at the beginning of the COVID scamdemic, you saw Antifa and BLM activated, in many of these cities. Remember, they said, well, they don't have to wear masks because they're protesting. And so these were paid. We were in front of the city hall in Los Angeles, and they had an encampment, Antifa, BLM encampment. And we talked to a lot of these different people, and they said they were being paid. All these people are being paid. Most of them are just out there just doing, because they believe in this. They're being paid by Open Society, by Soros, by a number of these other things. So I think what we have to realize is that we are in a spiritual battle. And that's why, once again, these open the heavens. That's why, in 2 Chronicles 7:14, it says, if my people called by my name, meaning God's people, will humble themselves, pray, seek his face, and lastly, turn from their wicked ways. As we're filming this, recording this the last day of September, tomorrow's October 1st at sundown, which is Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, the high holy day of the year, where, people fast and pray and repent. I believe we're going to come into a time that we're going to see God Almighty literally come down and rescue America and the world, and we're going to see a great awakening. But in the meantime, I do believe that we're going to see things get a little dicey. So, let's go into what's happening with Comey and the indictment and some of the things that I believe that are going to start happening. I know a lot of people are a little disillusioned. They think it's not enough. It's not fast enough. What would you have to say to people like that are listening today, SG?
Well, the very first thing I would say is that I completely and totally empathize, and I understand exactly where people are coming from. And I mean that genuinely. I mean that truly, authentically, and deeply. At the same time, when we look at playing for all of the marbles, we're not just playing for the marbles of DC. We're playing for the spiritual health of the entirety of the world. We're playing for the ability to self-control and direct our own societies. We're playing for the ability to exchange value with one another across international boundary lines and not have it siphoned off for black market criminal activity where people's children go to disappear in the middle of the night. When we're playing for all of the marbles, we have to keep in mind that peons like Jim Comey, and I use that very endearingly, are also useful. These individuals have intelligence, they have exposure, they have information access that they've had by virtue of their experience that they alone may be able to offer and provide. As we look at the indictments that were actually brought against Comey, the indictment itself looks really weak. Actually, there's a slew of different events that we could indict this particular individual on. The ones that they chose to seems like a shot across the bow, almost like getting them in the net to get them to play ball. And then seeing if they're going to play ball or not. That's sort of how I'm tracking this right now. And if we If we see this individual play ball with investigators and prosecutorial efforts, I think we move from there into the broader and deeper aspects of the Russiagate conspiracy and the self-direction of that by the Clinton campaign. And again, Comey was one of the individuals in the Barack Obama meeting where they were discussing the viability of, quote, the Clinton plan. So this is someone that is able to roll quite literally on the former president of the United States if we needed him to, certainly able to roll on former Secretary Hillary Clinton and the entirety of the Clinton campaign, potentially even the Democrat National Committee. And so all of this to say there's a lot of usefulness, there's a lot of utilitarian value that comes in the service of true law, order, and justice in this process. And we have to keep in mind that President Trump has told us a number of different times, including very recently, just in the last few days, that this is going to get deep and wide enough that military courts will be utilized in some form or fashion, and the former president of the United States, Barack Obama, will face treason charges in either a civilian or military court. One of the memes that President Trump has put out suggests that it'll be at the behest of a military tribunal. So that's not a small matter. This is a generational event. This is a major, major significant event in United States history to arrive at a point like that. And so when we look at useful idiots like Jim Comey, do I want the man to pay for what the FBI has been allowed to do under his watch? Absolutely, I do. But more than that, I want the criminality ended permanently. I want the problem permanently resolved and stamped out and placed into the annals of our history as a stain that we can look back on, rather than an existential and current threat that we have to deal with.
Well, and as we kind of wrap it up today, it's always about the children. And even as Jesus says, what they do to the least of these, they do unto me. And I remember when Obama first came into office, in prayer one morning, I heard God speak to me, SG, and he said, Obama's committed treason. I heard that a long time ago. And so right now, what is happening is things are being exposed. It takes time for exposure. I mean, living in LA, living in Hollywood, and God told me to build a studio to rival Disney. Well, Disney, you look at a lot of the indoctrination now that Disney has been doing over the last 50 years or so. And they owned the narrative. They owned so many of the new media, the studios, they had the content, they had the media, but we're taking it back, and it has to come down before it will be resurrected and rebuilt. And I've talked to people recently that said Hollywood, these sound stages are like a ghost town. And so, but God is getting ready to breathe upon these dry bones, and we're going to see, I believe, the greatest show on earth. And so let not your heart be troubled. As we close out today, just from like the bottom of your heart, what would you tell the people, SG? Because I know a lot of people love listening to you. You're just so, the way you put together things so succinctly, and you're just such a good human being. We're a family. And that's the thing, a lot of people are digging and what about this? And why aren't they exposing the Epstein files? And why this, why that? But it's the bigger picture. And, God is the one that sovereignly is looking down at all this. And people think, well, why doesn't God do something? But he uses us. He gave us now, after Jesus died and went to heaven, he told us, now you go and make disciples out of all nations. So it's really we, the people, that have to do it. So what would you say to that effect to the people that are listening today that are waiting for somebody else to do it? But what would you say to them, SG?
I think that what I would say to everyone, and I really do mean this, it is all about following what the Spirit calls us to do from where we are at. God will never ask us to do something that we are not prepared, equipped, and capable of doing, because that would simply be unfair. If you were to ask a 10th or 11th grade baseball player to perform at a major league level, it's fundamentally unfair. And I think all of us sort of understand that. There's not enough time to refine the skill and the craft. There's not enough life experience there to produce major league results in that 10th or 11th grade player. And so God will meet each and every person out there where they are at. If you're called to run for office in your community, by all means do that. If you're called to just sit down and form a social group and have coffee and talk about these missing children, go and do that. that, whatever it feels, truly good. And I don't mean good for pleasure. I mean good in your spirit for you to do, and that gives you momentum and some liveliness, so some excitement and some vigor. That's what I would encourage people to focus upon. And you mentioned something a moment ago that I'd like to close out with, Meri, and it's about the children. The entirety of the Great Awakening is for a number of different things, in my opinion. But one of those things is the age of the restoration of innocence. Jesus said, whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. And we're headed for a world where Christ is king. We know that. The book tells us that the world, post the apocalyptic death of these particular Satanists, and they are Satanists, the world moves into a Christ-ruled, Christ-focused era. And so if that's the case, that means that respect for the innocence and the love of children is going to become natural again, and it's going to be honored again, and it's going to be reinfused into our behavior as adults and as parents and as educators and teachers and guides and mentors, as we look not only at our own children, but of all the children around us. And that's a process. That's a process of refinement. It takes time for a spiritual lesson like that to transform and transmute itself in God's children. When we look at, the Israelite nation, for example, it took them 40 years. I don't think it's going to take us that long, but I know that we're only 8 to 9 years consciously into this process at this point. And so the more of us that come together in acceptance and graciousness, understanding that this is about changing the world for the betterment of the children of the future, for the betterment of my child, for the betterment of all of the people out there watching that have children and grandchildren of their own. This is about creating a world where Taken is not a documentary, but an action film from an era gone by. And that, to me, is worth waiting for.
Yes, well said, SG. It is important for people to come together in unity. Yes, it's good to watch podcasts, it's good to listen to these shows, but there's nothing, I believe, more important than when people come together and you actually get to see the people and you get to pray for the people. And SG, you've been at 5 of these Open the Heavens events, and hopefully you'll be at the one in Vegas coming up. But we pray for people at the end of these. I know Juan was at the one in Champions Church, and somebody had a prophetic word for Juan that God was going to put almost like a Faraday cage around him to protect him. And there was a major prayer for Juan, and he talked about the very next week, he was walking across the street and there was a car coming directly for him in a gold Mercedes, out of nowhere pulled out in front of this car and literally stopped the other car from hitting Juan, because he would have been killed. And Juan has said that many times too on the phone. He said those prayers really worked. So at these events, it's not just going to be hearing some incredible speakers and things that are going to happen. It's actually going to bring us together in community and unity. And I believe God is raising up a great movement by his spirit, greater than any move known to man. So if it's free to register, you go to mericrowley.com. Or if you want to get a VIP ticket, there's only going to be 160 VIP tickets sold, which includes lunch, special seating, underground parking, and meet and greet with the speakers. SG, you remember the meet and greets, right? Where you were in the rooms for the VIP and people came through. And what do you think about those VIP meet and greets that you were part of, SG?
Well, I will say that it's always a genuine pleasure to get a chance to connect with spiritual brothers and sisters out there. And the good book tells us that there's power in fellowship. Jesus himself said, where 2 or more are gathered, there I am in their midst. But the prerequisite is more than one. And so as been my experience in these events, having that association, that familiarity, coming together and supporting one another, it provides a significant boost and a recharge that I think is hard to replicate in any other fashion, quite frankly.
Yeah. So anyway, well, listen, SG, thanks for coming on. Thanks for watching. Now is the time. Please follow or subscribe, and please share this with as many people as you can. And also make comments. It does help the algorithms. They've recently shadow banned me a lot more on Rumble. And so anyway, you know what? God said it's not how many views, it's not how many in the pews, but as long as we don't hit the snooze and we don't drink too much booze, we're going to go through all the way, because this is going to be an hour that it will be the greatest show on earth. So thanks for watching. Hope to see some of you in San Francisco. Thank you, SG, for coming on And hopefully we'll get to come on your show and talk about the showdown in San Francisco about Anton LaVey and what happened with Pastor Dave Bryan and some of the things that are going to be happening in October. So God bless you all. Thanks for watching. The best is yet to come. See you soon.